Before we ride into this story, hit like and subscribe. Thank you. Fire Base Coral, South Vietnam, May 16, 1968, 0230 hours. The night air tasted like cordite and wet clay. Somewhere beyond the wire, the jungle pressed in like a living thing, breathing slow, patient breaths. Inside the perimeter, men moved under red-filtered lights and cigarette embers, shadows with rifles. Americans doing what Americans did in Vietnam, stacking gear, checking radios, loading extra magazines, preparing for the worst by carrying half the world on their backs. First Lieutenant Brad Keller of the 101st Airborne stood on the sandbagged berm and watched a scene that made his brain reject what his eyes were telling it. 6 Australians, SASR, were getting ready to go out, and they were getting lighter. They weren't adding equipment. They were stripping it away with a calm, almost ritual precision. One man loosened his webbing and let it fall a notch. Another emptied a pouch, counted rounds with a thumb, then put half of them back into the ammo crate like he was returning borrowed money. A third adjusted the sling on his rifle, tested the tension, then removed something small and metal from his pocket and handed it off without a word. Keller squinted, thinking maybe he was missing something in the dark. But no, he wasn't wrong. They were leaving behind radios. They were leaving behind night vision devices. They were leaving behind extra water, extra ammo, anything that looked like insurance. Each man carried one primary weapon, roughly 200 rounds, 4 grenades, a canteen, and the kind of empty space in their kit that made American sergeants itch to correct it. No rucksacks, no ponchos, no spare socks, no sleeping gear, no rations beyond a few compressed protein bars that looked like dog treats. The Australians moved like men who already knew the ending and weren't interested in arguing with it. One of them, older than the rest, shoulders like carved stone, pulled a small emergency beacon from a pouch, opened it, and removed the batteries with deliberate care. He walked them over to the firebase quartermaster and dropped them into an open palm as casually as spare change. Keller climbed down off the berm before he could talk himself out of it. He felt heat rise in his chest. Not anger, not exactly, but the nervous energy of a responsible officer watching something irresponsible happen on his watch. He approached the older man. "Sergeant," the Australian looked at him. In the thin light, Keller saw eyes that weren't tired so much as finished. Eyes that had spent too long staring into places most men tried not to imagine. "Yes, Lieutenant?" Keller nodded toward the stripped-down kit. "You're going into the Sucha Valley, right? Intelligence says there's at least a regiment-sized NVA force in there." The Australian's mouth twitched, not a smile, a recognition that the kid was trying. "They're in there," the sergeant said, "and they're not alone." Keller swallowed. "Then why are you leaving your emergency beacon?" The sergeant held Keller's gaze for a beat that stretched too long. Then he glanced down at his own harness like a man considering a math problem. "Beacons have to be carried," he said. "Weight slows you down." Keller frowned. "Weight slows you down, sure, but it also keeps you alive." The sergeant's voice stayed mild, almost kind. "If we're slow, we get detected. If we get detected against a regiment, a beacon won't save us." He tapped his chest with 2 fingers, lightly, like knocking on a door. "Moving fast will, staying invisible will, so we leave the beacon." Keller tried again, because sometimes you had to press the issue even when you knew you were out of your depth. "What about extraction? If you need emergency evac?" The Australian finally smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. It was a smile a man wore the way he wore camouflage. "We won't need extraction, Lieutenant." He shifted the rifle on his shoulder as if it was part of his spine. "We'll walk out when the job's done." Keller stared at him. 6 men, into that valley, for days. The sergeant nodded once. 3 days from now, we'll be back here, and we'll bring you something your generals will use to plan a divisional operation. Keller's voice came out sharper than he intended. "That's not a mission, that's suicide." The Australian Sergeant Jacko, they called him, turned toward the wire. The other 5 were already moving, ghosting toward the gate, not talking, not laughing, not making the kind of noise men made when they wanted to convince themselves they weren't afraid. Jacko paused just long enough to speak over his shoulder, as if tossing a coin Keller would spend for the rest of his life. "You Americans send soldiers," he said. "Good soldiers, brave soldiers." He looked back once, and Keller felt that look like a weight. "But we don't send soldiers, mate. We send warriors." A beat, a small flat certainty. There's a difference. Then he was gone, and the jungle swallowed them like it had been waiting. 72 hours later, the Australians walked back through the wire. They came in at dusk, silhouettes in the failing light, moving with the same controlled pace they'd left with, as if the valley hadn't tried to kill them, as if the jungle hadn't been full of men who would have cut their throats for a cigarette. One of them limped, not theatrically, not "look at me," limping. The kind of limp you only notice if you're paying attention. But they walked. They walked in with mud dried in layers on their uniforms, with leaves woven into their webbing, with faces hollowed by dehydration and hunger. And they carried nothing that looked like victory. No enemy flags, no trophy weapons, no body count. What they carried was worse. They carried notebooks sealed in plastic, film canisters, sketches of bunker layouts, hand-drawn maps so precise Keller couldn't believe they were made by men crawling through triple canopy jungle instead of a staff officer leaning over a clean table. They carried coordinates, numbers that would become artillery fire missions and airstrike runs. They carried enemy strengths and schedules. They carried a future the NVA didn't know was already falling toward them. When the American intelligence officer started the debrief, his voice sounded normal. By the 10th minute, he was speaking the way people speak in church, like they didn't want to break something sacred. "How close were you?" he asked at one point. Jacko's answer was simple. close enough to hear them talk. Another operator, one of the scouts, added quietly, close enough to smell their cooking. Keller watched the Americans in the tent exchange looks. They weren't looks of admiration, not yet. They were looks of recalibration. The kind you see when a man realizes the rules he lived by aren't the only rules that work. Later, Keller found his chance to speak to Jacko outside the debrief tent. The night had settled in again, humid and thick. Mosquitoes whined. Distant artillery thumped like a giant's heartbeat. Keller stepped up, careful not to sound like a kid. I owe you an apology, he said. Jacko looked at him as if he'd forgotten Keller existed and then remembered. For what? I thought you were taking unnecessary risks, Keller said. I didn't understand what you were capable of. Jacko's shoulders rose and fell once, barely a shrug. No apology necessary, Lieutenant. He glanced toward the jungle like a man checking the weather. You were thinking like a soldier. He met Keller's eyes again. We're not soldiers. Keller waited. Jacko didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The evidence was already in the tent behind them. Ink and film and coordinates that would light the valley on fire. The story of how they got that intelligence didn't hit Keller immediately. Not fully. It took time. It took retellings. It took the kind of details men only share when the beer is warm and the night is long. The Sucha Valley was a nightmare even on paper. Steep terrain, dense jungle, known heavy enemy presence. American recon flights had taken heavy anti-aircraft fire. Ground reconnaissance had been labeled too risky. The divisional commander wanted answers, and every conventional method had bounced off the jungle like rain off stone. So the Australians volunteered, not loudly, not with speeches. Just a quiet yes, give us time. Jacko's patrol was 6 men. Jacko, 2 signalers, 2 scouts, and a medic. They carried about half what Keller's men would carry for a fraction of the distance. They inserted not by helicopter, too loud, too obvious, but on foot, slipping out from Firebase Coral like a rumor. The first 2 days were just movement, 40 kilometers through difficult terrain, mostly at night, navigating by dead reckoning and instinct. The jungle punished them for every mistake. Roots that grabbed ankles, vines that pulled at rifles, leeches that found skin like guided missiles. By the time they reached the valley's edge, they were already tired, and the real work hadn't started. For the next 8 days, they moved the way predators move when prey is everywhere. Slow when they had to be, fast when they could be, invisible always. They found 3 separate NVA battalion base camps. They found supply caches, thousands of rounds, rockets, mortar shells, the kind of stockpiles that meant something big was coming. They photographed fortified positions, bunkers, anti-aircraft emplacements tucked beneath canopy so thick it swallowed sound. They counted soldiers, not guesses, not we saw movement, counts, numbers with confidence behind them. Over 1,500 enemy troops, many in new uniforms with newer weapons, fresh resupply, fresh intent. Most critically, they intercepted radio traffic, and with a linguist's ear, they pieced together a schedule. Early June, 2 weeks, enough time for Americans to plan. The intelligence was extraordinary, but what made it legendary was the method. Jacko's men operated for 8 days within a few hundred meters of an enemy regiment, and the enemy never knew they were there. They moved through base camp outskirts in daylight. They photographed fortifications from distances that would have gotten other recon teams killed. They did it by moving so slowly the human eye couldn't register it. An inch, pause, breathe, pause, an inch, pause. One member described lying in shallow vegetation, covered in mud, breathing through his nose in tiny sips, while an NVA sentry walked past so close he could have reached out and grabbed the man's ankle. 3 meters. Less, maybe. The sentry never saw him. That wasn't courage. Not the loud kind. It was discipline so extreme it looked like insanity. And then came the complication the jungle always delivered. Day 6. One of the scouts, Trooper Kevin Walsh, stepped on a pungy stake. A sharpened bamboo spike hidden in the trail meant to cripple and infect. It drove through his boot and into his foot with a wet resistance that made him bite down so hard his jaw ached. Walsh didn't scream, he didn't even curse. He pulled the stake out, cleaned the wound the best he could, and only told the medic, not Jacko, not the others. Because Walsh knew something Keller didn't understand until later. In units like that, pain wasn't the main threat. Failure was. Walsh kept moving for 2 more days on a foot that swelled and turned angry in the tropical heat. He didn't slow the patrol, he didn't complain. He walked on willpower and stubbornness and the quiet shame he would have felt if he'd been the reason the mission ended early. Only when the work was done, only when the cameras were full and the notes were sealed and the coordinates were secure, did Walsh admit the injury had gone bad. By then, his foot was infected. He could barely walk. And now the patrol faced the problem Keller had asked about at 0230 hours. Extraction. A helicopter pickup in enemy territory would be loud. It would reveal the patrol's presence. It might compromise everything they'd learned and maybe get a bird shot down on top of it. Jacko made a decision without drama. We carry him. 5 men took turns carrying a 6th man through 40 kilometers of jungle, while still staying silent, still staying hidden, still avoiding enemy forces that would have killed them if detected. They rotated on 20-minute intervals, one man carrying Walsh in a fireman's carry, another taking extra gear, another stepping in when legs started to shake. They moved like a machine built out of flesh and grit and mutual obligation. It took them 3 days to cover ground they'd covered in 2 on the way in. 3 days of exhaustion that bordered on hallucination, hands slipping on sweat-slicked straps, knees buckling on slopes, leeches fattening on ankles, and they made it. They walked back through the wire on schedule. Only then did Walsh let himself be taken to medical. His foot required surgery and weeks of antibiotics, but he'd finished the mission. In the debrief tent, American officers stared at the photos and maps like they were looking at witchcraft. They had angles on bunkers that shouldn't have been possible without being seen. They had strength estimates accurate down to numbers that later proved true within a couple dozen men, and the Australians had done it without firing a shot. No support calls, no emergency extract, no heroic last stand. Just patience. Silence. Fieldcraft so refined, it made the jungle itself feel inadequate. The intelligence led directly to Operation Overlord in early June 1968. American airmobile forces inserted directly on top of NVA positions, achieving surprise so complete the enemy was caught in base camps before they could disperse. The planned offensive was disrupted before it could begin. Hundreds of Allied lives may have been saved, quietly, invisibly, by 6 men who chose to carry less so they could become less. That was what Keller finally understood. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't recklessness. It was a different math. If that had been the only story, it would have been enough. But the Australians didn't stop being themselves just because Americans started watching more closely. In August 1969, another SASR patrol did something so audacious that even seasoned Special Forces officers struggled to accept it as real. Intelligence had identified a Viet Cong district headquarters operating out of a village deep in enemy-controlled territory. Senior leadership used it to plan, coordinate, control the local apparatus. Hit it hard enough and you didn't just kill men, you shattered structure. The location was the problem. Surrounded by hostile territory, any conventional approach would be detected. Helicopters would draw fire and warn the target. American Special Forces assessed the mission and recommended against it. Too risky, too uncertain. The Australians looked at the same map and saw an opening. 5 men, led by Sergeant Bill Morrison. They would infiltrate on foot at night, hide near the village during the day, observe, and hit at dawn when human alertness hit its lowest point. Swift entry, capture leadership, grab documents, leave before anyone understood what had happened. 4 days, total. American commanders approved it mostly because the alternative was doing nothing, and doing nothing was its own kind of defeat. Morrison's team inserted 30 kilometers from the target and started moving. They moved without lights. They navigated by stars and terrain feel, by the shape of darkness against darker darkness. They spoke in touches and hand signals. Their spacing was so tight they could feel the man ahead through the brush, like blind men moving by trust alone. During the day they hid in places that were miserable, thorny thickets and steep slopes and dense vegetation where even moving an elbow could leave scratches that bled. They chose the kind of terrain that hurt to enter because hurt kept other men away. By the 3rd day they were near the village. They observed from concealment with binoculars, counting personnel, noting patterns, identifying which building was headquarters. Security was tight in daylight, sentries posted, movement watched, but as night deepened, vigilance softened. After midnight, men got lazy, some sentries sat down, some nodded off. Morrison picked 0400 hours, not because it sounded dramatic, because it was the statistically lowest point of human alertness, when even disciplined men fought sleep with heavy eyelids and slower thoughts. The Australians covered the final 800 meters in 2 hours. 2 hours to move less than a kilometer. They bypassed sentries by using terrain so miserable the VC assumed nobody would attempt it. They crawled through a drainage ditch filled with stagnant water, leeches latching on like small, eager hands. They climbed a wall using cracks in mortar, fingers searching for holds in the dark. They reached the target building without being detected. Through a window they confirmed bodies on mats, sleeping shapes, weapons leaned against walls, a faint soft sound of breathing and snoring. Morrison didn't hesitate. He kicked in the door. The team flowed in like water, fast, controlled, silent in the way only practiced violence can be. Suppressed weapons pointed, commands in whispers, bodies pinned before brains woke up. 5 VC officials were secured in under 10 seconds. No firefight, no alarm, no village rising in chaos. The officials were so disoriented by sudden awakening that resistance never took shape. Hands were flex-cuffed, documents swept into bags, maps rolled tight, a radio set yanked free. 90 seconds after the door came down, the Australians were already leaving. The entire village still slept. Now came the hard part, extraction with prisoners. 5 prisoners would slow them down, and once the village woke and discovered leadership missing, pursuit would come fast and angry. Morrison made a decision that was tactically brilliant and psychologically brutal. "We move fast," he told his men. "They keep up or they get left." They set a pace just short of a run. The prisoners stumbled through jungle darkness, wrists bound, breath ragged, feet slipping on roots. If one fell, an Australian hauled him up and shoved him forward. There was no gentleness, no reassurance. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was the cold truth of distance and time. They needed to stay ahead of pursuit, and that meant speed. They covered 30 kilometers in 18 hours, an extraordinary pace even without prisoners. When they reached friendly lines, the prisoners were alive, exhausted, dehydrated, bruised by falls, but alive and valuable. The documents were intact, the maps legible. The intelligence that followed dismantled a VC district-level structure, leading to follow-on operations that destroyed infrastructure across the region, and the psychological impact was enormous. A headquarters that believed itself secure in its own village had been raided by an enemy that appeared from nowhere, took leadership, and vanished back into jungle like it had never existed. Rumors spread. Some said it had been a company-sized raid. Some swore helicopters must have been involved. The truth, that it was 5 Australians on foot, was so audacious that even enemy intelligence reportedly struggled to accept it. American Special Forces officers briefed on the operation listened with narrowed eyes and the slow frown of men whose worldview was cracking. When asked how they did it, Morrison's explanation was almost insulting in its simplicity. "We moved at night," he said. "We used terrain they thought was impassable. We hit them when they were asleep, and we moved faster on the way out than they thought was possible." Then, like Jacko, Morrison offered the deeper truth without dressing it up. "They were thinking like guerrillas defending territory," he said. "We were thinking like hunters." To understand why Americans both admired and distrusted the SASR, you had to understand the uncomfortable implication their success carried. The Australians weren't winning because they had better gear. They often had less. They weren't winning because they had more support. They often had none. They weren't winning because they were reckless. Recklessness gets you killed quickly in that jungle. They were winning because they operated on a different philosophy, one that made conventional doctrine feel like a polite lie. The SASR had been formed in 1957, modeled after Britain's 22 SAS, shaped by hard lessons from jungle warfare in places like Malaya. But Australians didn't just copy methods, they pushed them. Australian military culture had been forged in campaigns where quitting wasn't an option because there was no rescue, no easy return, no comforting certainty that the system would save you. Gallipoli, the Western Front, North Africa, New Guinea's brutal track warfare. Again and again, Australians had faced impossible situations and refused to accept the verdict. That stubborn refusal hardened into identity. SASR selection wasn't designed to find the strongest men. It was designed to find a mind. The men who passed weren't the ones who followed orders perfectly. They were the ones who recognized when orders were wrong and made decisions anyway, then accepted full responsibility if those decisions got someone killed. Candidates were given navigation problems with missing data. Equipment failed at the worst moments. Instructors offered contradictions on purpose. Confusion was the point. Stress was the point. Most broke. Not because the physical requirements were impossible, but because uncertainty is heavier than any rucksack. Those who made it through learned self-sufficiency as a religion. They became expert marksmen, demolitions capable, medically competent, language familiar, but beyond the skill checklist, they were trained to solve problems in the field without waiting for permission. If you needed rope and didn't have rope, you made it. If your radio died, you found another way. If you were outnumbered 50-1, you didn't fight harder. You vanished. You watched. You chose the moment. They were conditioned to treat the jungle not as an obstacle, but as a weapon. When they deployed to Vietnam, the environment rewarded their worldview. Their assigned operational area, thick jungle, swamps, steep slopes, hidden tunnel systems, made large-scale American sweeps blunt and often pointless. The enemy melted away, survived, returned. The Australians didn't chase ghosts with battalions. They hunted patterns with patrols, 5 or 6 men, sometimes 4. They infiltrated on foot to avoid announcing themselves with helicopter blades. They established patrol bases in places even enemy patrols avoided. Then they split into 2-man elements that moved so slowly and carefully a few hundred meters could take a day. They didn't measure success in firefights, they measured it in not being detected. American units, often brave, often skilled, operated under a different clock. 12-month tours, constant rotation, pressure to produce results quickly, patrols that lasted 2 or 3 days, a need to bring back something tangible. SASR patrols sometimes stayed out for weeks. They stripped calories to the minimum, they drank from streams, they lost weight and lived in discomfort until discomfort became normal. That endurance wasn't romantic. It was ugly, sweaty, leech-bitten reality, and it produced intelligence that could reshape entire campaigns without a single bullet fired. That, more than anything, made Americans uneasy. Because if 6 men with minimal gear could achieve what battalions couldn't, what did that say about the way the war was being fought? From 1966 to 1971, the SASR conducted thousands of patrols in hostile territory and suffered remarkably low casualty rates compared to the risks they accepted. Their operational impact far exceeded their numbers. A unit that never exceeded roughly 100+ men deployed at one time influenced regions, disrupted infrastructure, and created fear disproportionate to its size. Captured documents and prisoner interrogations suggested enemy units were instructed, when possible, to avoid contact with Australian patrols. Not because Australians were invincible, but because they were unpredictable. They appeared where they shouldn't. They killed quietly. They disappeared. Fighting them felt like fighting something that didn't obey the rules of the jungle. Ghosts. And ghosts are exhausting to fear because you can't ever relax. You can't ever be sure you're safe. That psychological strain degraded enemy effectiveness as surely as artillery. American forces learned from the Australians, often quietly, informally. Operators watched. They copied small things, longer patrols, smaller teams, an emphasis on invisibility over engagement, the use of difficult terrain as protection rather than something to avoid. It rarely showed up in official doctrine with a neat citation, but it spread, because good ideas in war don't need permission mission to survive. Years later, when Australian SASR operators deployed to Afghanistan and Iraq, they carried the same mindset their predecessors had carried into the Vietnamese jungle: independence, risk acceptance, small teams, patience, the refusal to rely on rescue as a plan, different deserts, different enemies, same philosophy. Back at Firebase Coral in May 1968, Keller couldn't have known any of that. All he knew was what he'd seen: 6 men stripping down instead of bulking up, walking out into a valley that terrified planners, returning like shadows with a handful of paper that would turn into a storm of bombs. What Jacko had said haunted him because it wasn't an insult. It was a diagnosis. You were thinking like a soldier, and Keller realized something that made his stomach tighten, even as he admired it. The Australians weren't braver in the simple Hollywood way. They weren't immune to fear. They just had a different relationship with it. Fear was data. Fear was background noise. Fear was something you carried lightly so it didn't slow you down. They weren't better men in a moral sense. They were better suited, psychologically, to a type of warfare that punished hesitation and rewarded invisibility. And when American soldiers watched them walk back through the wire, muddy, gaunt, one man limping, all of them calm, they understood what warrior meant in that context. Not a chest-thumping word, not a slogan. A way of operating where the mission was the only anchor and everything else, comfort, backup plans, even rescue, was optional weight. In Vietnam, most of the war was loud: helicopters, artillery, body counts, sweeping operations, endless friction. But running parallel to it was another war entirely, a quiet war, a shadow war. And in that war, sometimes 6 men with rifles and patience could accomplish more than a battalion with air support, because they weren't trying to dominate the jungle. They were becoming part of it, warriors, not soldiers. And once you saw the difference, you couldn't unsee it.